He thought he was building a rap empire, but the feds say he was building a drug pipeline. This is how Montana 700's dream turned into a federal case. Every bar he rapped came straight from the streets, but what if those same lyrics are now being used to lock him up? This is the dark side of Montana 700's story. One morning, the feds kicked in his door, but this wasn't random. They'd been watching Montana 700 for years. Here's how they built their case from his own music. He came from nothing, no help, no handouts, just hustle. But now that same hustle got him facing decades behind bars. This is how fast it can flip. Before the fame, before the indictments, there was just a kid from South Dallas trying to survive. So how did his story end up in a federal courtroom? Rapper Montana 700 has just been charged in a federal case, with prosecutors claiming he was out here moving pounds. Montana, who built his reputation both in the streets and in rap, is now facing the same system that's already been watching his close homie, Zillionaire Doe. What started as rap fame is now spiraling into a full-scale federal investigation, and according to officials, the feds haven't just been watching recently. They've been tracking everything. But before the agents, indictments, and headlines, there was just Montana 700, a kid from South Dallas trying to make something out of nothing. His story begins long before the spotlight, in a neighborhood where survival wasn't guaranteed and opportunity rarely knocked. Montana grew up surrounded by the same struggles that shaped so many others from his block: poverty, loyalty, and pressure to make fast money. The system didn't offer much, and the streets became the classroom. Every corner told a story, and for Montana, those stories turned into lyrics. He was raised in the same environment that produced names like Zillionaire Doe, another local figure who hustled his way into both fame and federal scrutiny. The two shared similar beginnings, grinding out of the trenches, trying to turn hard lessons into success. But in South Dallas, the line between hustling and living has always been razor-thin. Montana's rise in rap was quick but gritty. His voice carried the pain, ambition, and pride of his neighborhood. Fans loved him because he sounded real, not like an artist reading about the struggle, but like someone who'd survived it. His music painted pictures of the block, the late nights, the loyalty, the losses, and that authenticity set him apart. But that same authenticity would later bring heat. As Montana's fame grew, so did the attention, not just from fans, but from law enforcement. His lyrics mentioned things that, to outsiders, sounded like art. But to investigators, they sounded like clues. Behind the scenes, federal agents were already piecing together information. They weren't just looking at what Montana said, they were tracking who he was around, where his money came from, and how his lifestyle lined up with his income. The feds believed there was more than music funding the rise of Montana 700. They began digging into his past, the people he ran with, the blocks he represented, the digital footprints left on phones and social media. What they saw wasn't just a rapper building his image. They saw what they believed was a pipeline connecting neighborhoods and moving pounds across state lines. For the feds, that was enough to turn a neighborhood success story into a federal target. And that's the irony of Montana's journey. The same background that made his music powerful is now part of what prosecutors are using against him. To them, the struggle that built him wasn't inspiration, it was evidence. Now, what started as local rap fame has turned into one of the most closely watched cases out of South Dallas, a story where art, ambition, and the streets have collided under the harsh light of federal law. Where are you from? Wood Oak. He wasn't born with money, and the world didn't hand him anything easy. What he did have was hustle, ambition, and a reputation that quickly started to grow. From a young age, Montana was around the type of environment where trapping wasn't just an option. It was the blueprint. Older homies and even family showed him what it meant to flip products, stack cash, and build respect. By the time most kids his age were still figuring life out, Montana had already touched more money than some adults see in years. Word on the block was that he wasn't just moving small amounts, he was making real plays, and that's how he got his name buzzing before rap even came into the picture. But the thing about street fame is that it spreads fast. And with that comes attention not just from the hood, but from the police. Stories circulated about Montana's early years, from late-night runs to flashy stunts with money. The type of lifestyle that felt larger than life for a young hustler also painted a target on his back. Local authorities were well aware of Montana 700 before the feds ever said his name. What separated Montana from a lot of others, though, was his presence. He wasn't just hustling in silence. He carried himself with a confidence that made people pay attention. Whether it was in interviews, on social media, or in the way he popped out in public, Montana always showed the world he wasn't just a regular dude from Dallas. His persona was loud, bold, and unapologetic. The hood respected him, and when you've got that kind of pull, it doesn't take long before music starts to follow. And that's exactly what happened. Even while trapping, Montana started turning his stories into lyrics. The same tales he lived day to day became the soundtrack to his come-up. It gave him authenticity in a rap world where a lot of rappers fake it. But Montana, he lived it. When he said he was moving weight, people believed him because they had seen it with their own eyes. That's the kind of credibility money can't buy. But authenticity comes with a price. Rapping about the streets while still being active in them is a dangerous mix. The very same bars that made Montana respected in music also became breadcrumbs for law enforcement to follow. Investigators look for patterns, and Montana's early reputation was enough to put him on their radar. He was living too large for someone without a 9 to F5. And when the flashy lifestyle connects to known hotspots of criminal activity, that's the type of formula that builds a federal file. Montana's early days laid the foundation for both his success and his problems. On one side, he was becoming a voice for his block, somebody who could put his neighborhood on the map. On the other side, he was stacking enemies, attention, and surveillance. The streets loved him. The rap game started to recognize him, but behind closed doors, the feds were already taking notes. They don't move quickly. They build cases slowly, watching, recording, and waiting until the right moment. Montana's early life ends with him standing on the edge of two worlds: the raw hustle of the streets that gave him everything, and the promise of rap stardom that could have taken him out. Nobody saw it coming, not back then, when Montana 700 was just starting to buzz. But the choices he made early on are the same ones now threatening to take everything away. What once looked like a fast rise to rap success has turned into a federal case, with prosecutors claiming Montana's empire wasn't built on music alone. From the block to the booth, Montana's climb from the streets of South Dallas to the mic didn't happen overnight. But when it did, it felt real. The hood had already stamped his name before the industry even knew who he was. His fans weren't quoting some made-up stories, they were repeating moments they'd actually seen. That's the thing about authenticity. When people know you've lived what you rap, your words hit harder. Montana understood that. His songs sounded less like entertainment and more like confessions, verses about flipping packs, dodging raids, and stacking dirty cash. These weren't fantasies. They were snapshots of his reality, raw, unpolished, and brutally honest. His early videos reflected that too, shot right in the same blocks that made him famous, surrounded by the same faces from his come-up. That unfiltered energy is what drew people in. The streets wanted something real, and Montana gave it to them, line by line. The buzz that turned into a movement. Montana's local fame spread fast. Clips of him rapping with his crew, flashing cash, and living exactly what he talked about started to blow up online. It wasn't fake or industry manufactured. It was Montana 700 being himself, unapologetically. Before long, his name wasn't just bouncing around Dallas. Blogs, playlists, and DJs started picking him up. His link with Zillionaire Doe gave him even more exposure and more heat. The two weren't just friends, they were symbols of the same lifestyle. But with Doe already under federal watch, that connection made Montana a person of interest too. If the feds were watching Doe, they were definitely watching Montana standing beside him. When real life becomes evidence. As Montana's fame grew, so did his visuals. His music videos started to level up, better production, bigger scenes, more jewelry, more cars. But that success came with a hidden cost. The same things that made his music videos powerful also made them evidence in the eyes of investigators. Flashing stacks of cash, rapping about pounds, showing off familiar faces from the block, all of it started to blur the line between entertainment and self-incrimination. What fans saw as Montana keeping it real, law enforcement saw as confirmation. To them, his lyrics weren't metaphors, they were receipts. The price of being too real. Despite the growing attention from authorities, Montana's music kept gaining traction. His delivery was sharp, his storytelling vivid, and his sound started moving beyond Dallas. Whispers of label interest began to circulate. It finally looked like he might make that rare jump from trapping in the shadows to rapping under the lights. But the deeper he went into music, the harder it became to separate the art from the life behind it. Every new song, every post, every video pulled more of his reality into the spotlight. Fans loved the truth in his words, but that same truth kept law enforcement locked onto his every move. Montana wasn't exaggerating for clout. He was documenting. And that made all the difference. The double-edged sword of authenticity. Montana 700's rise proved how dangerous being too real can be. His honesty gave him loyal fans, but it also built a narrative the feds could use. Every repost, every shoutout, every viral clip didn't just boost his fame, it fed the investigation. By the time Montana started taking rap seriously, both the streets and the industry knew his name. He wasn't just another rapper trying to make it, he was a story people couldn't stop watching. But while fans saw potential, investigators saw patterns. His lyrics, lifestyle, and circle all seemed to match the outline of an ongoing case. The case that changed everything. Montana 700 now stands at a dangerous crossroad, one path toward a legitimate career that could have changed his life, and another tied to the same streets that raised him. What he didn't realize was that his music wasn't just building his fame, it was building the prosecution's case, one song at a time. The feds don't move fast, they move quietly. They watch, record, and wait until the evidence feels solid. And now, that moment has come. Montana's name didn't just appear in federal court overnight. This case has been brewing for years. According to sources close to the situation, the indictment includes conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, possession with intent to distribute, and interstate trafficking. The same story that once made him a local legend might now cost him everything. For Montana 700, the grind that built his name may also be the reason it ends up written inside a federal case file. Digital devices, all hinting at a larger operation behind the scenes. And because Montana was closely tied to Zillionaire Doe, whose block had already been raided, investigators decided to take a closer look. The feds don't move on rumors. They act when they believe the puzzle pieces connect. And in this case, Montana's name reportedly came up more than once in those connections. The wiretaps and the web. A key part of the indictment is wiretap evidence. Court documents suggest that investigators were listening to coded calls and intercepted messages where Montana's name or alias appeared in conversations about moving weight. Even if he wasn't directly on the phone, just being mentioned in those discussions can be enough to tie someone into a federal conspiracy charge. That's what makes these cases so dangerous under federal law. You don't have to be caught with drugs in your hand. If prosecutors can argue you were part of an agreement to move them, that alone can mean years or even decades behind bars. Then comes the confidential informants, the hidden wildcard in nearly every big case. Sources believe that some people from Montana's circle may have flipped under pressure, trading testimony for lighter sentences. It's a classic federal tactic: go after the smaller names to build a case against the bigger ones. If even one of those witnesses points to Montana as a supplier, and the wiretaps or surveillance line up, that gives prosecutors a nearly airtight case. Following the money. The feds also claim they traced unexplained cash flow back to Montana. Like many rappers, he often showed off stacks of money and luxury items online. But to prosecutors, those posts weren't harmless, they were clues. In their eyes, that lifestyle looked less like rap money and more like evidence of drug proceeds. Investigators reportedly pulled bank records and found large cash deposits that they say matched the timeline of trafficking activity. And they didn't stop there. Federal agents went through social media posts, music videos, and lyrics, pointing out songs where Montana talked about moving pounds or shipping work. It's a move that's become common in modern cases, turning art into evidence. While defense lawyers will argue that it's just entertainment, juries often see it differently when the lyrics line up with real-life raids, weapons, and cash. The raid that changed everything. Montana's arrest wasn't quiet or subtle. In the early morning hours, federal agents and local task forces surrounded a house tied to him. Witnesses described armored trucks blocking the street as heavily armed officers stormed in. Montana was taken into custody without a fight, though others at the scene were also detained. Inside the home, agents reportedly found firearms, bundles of cash, and electronic devices believed to contain more evidence of trafficking. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a statement. The feds wanted everyone watching to understand. This was a serious case. Afterward, Montana was transferred to federal custody. Prosecutors pushed to keep him locked up without bond, calling him both a flight risk and a danger to the community. In drug conspiracy cases, those arguments often hold weight, and the judge agreed. Now, Montana sits behind bars as the government builds its case. The stakes couldn't be higher. For a rapper who had just started gaining momentum, the timing couldn't be worse. The charges against him aren't light, they carry mandatory minimum sentences that could easily stretch into decades. The conspiracy to distribute charge alone can bring 10 years or more, depending on the amounts the government claims. Add interstate trafficking, and you're talking about time that rivals a life sentence. That's why most defendants in these cases end up taking plea deals. The risk of going to trial is simply too high. Now, the streets are buzzing. Some say he'll fight it. Others say the feds have too much. Either way, one thing is clear. The story of Montana 700, once about music, hustle, and ambition, is now being rewritten inside a federal courtroom. Right now, the streets are divided. Some believe Montana 700 will hold his ground. Others aren't so sure the government's case is as strong as it looks. But here's the truth: federal prosecutors don't file charges unless they're confident they can win. With a conviction rate of over 90%, Montana is walking straight into one of the toughest fights of his life. This whole investigation shows how quickly the line between rap and real life can blur. For Montana, the same lifestyle that gave him credibility in music might be the one that ends up defining his courtroom story. Why the feds came for Montana? When you look at the case as a whole, one question keeps coming up: why him? Why would the government zero in on a rapper who was still on the rise instead of chasing some faceless figure quietly moving product in the background? The answer lies in visibility, influence, and narrative. Montana wasn't just another name in the streets, he was a symbol of authenticity. He didn't just rap about hustling, he lived it. And that realness, the thing that made people connect to his music, also made him a target. Its biggest challenge isn't just proving his innocence. It's proving that his music was expression, not evidence. So, when you ask why the feds set their sights on Montana 700, the answer is straightforward but heavy. He wasn't just one man making music. He was a symbol, a bridge between the streets and the rap scene. To prosecutors, that made him the perfect face for a bigger story. A familiar name they could use to explain a complicated conspiracy to a jury. In their eyes, Montana didn't just represent a case, he represented a culture. He became a target not only because of what he allegedly did, but because of who he was, who he knew, and what he stood for. The high price of mixing streets with rap. Montana 700's story feels like one we've seen too many times, the story of a young man who turned the hustle of his neighborhood into something creative, something real. He built his name off authenticity, that raw truth fans crave in an industry full of facades. But now, that same authenticity, the thing that made his music powerful, is being used against him. Every lyric, every flex, every moment of realness is now evidence in a federal case. When you trace his path, it almost feels inevitable. His early street roots gave him respect and credibility, but they also planted seeds that would never fade. As his fame grew, so did the spotlight, not just on his music, but on the life behind it. And now, with charges filed and investigators watching every move, Montana's story is being rewritten in a courtroom, not a recording booth. A perfect target. The reasons the feds went after him are no mystery. His connection to zillionaire dough, the flashy lifestyle, the coded lyrics, and the constant eyes on his neighborhood all made him stand out. To prosecutors, Montana wasn't just another rapper. He was a case study, living proof, in their view, of how rap and street life overlap. They can take his story, play it in front of a jury, and say, "This is what we're fighting." And with the feds' conviction rate sitting above 90%, the odds couldn't be tougher. The lesson behind the music. The deeper message here goes beyond one artist. It's about the danger of blending art with reality. Rap thrives on truth, on raw, lived experience. But when that experience crosses into real crimes, the line between expression and confession starts to fade. For Montana, that line has become the battlefield. Every song, every photo, every caption can be twisted into a narrative that serves the prosecution. What happens next is uncertain. He could take his chances at trial and fight for his freedom, or take a plea deal to lessen the blow. Either way, his career, the one that was just starting to rise, now hangs by a thread. The final question. So now the world watches and waits. Will Montana 700 survive the storm, beat the odds, rebuild, and turn this into a comeback story? Or will he become another name added to the long list of rappers whose past caught up before their future could shine? One thing's for sure, Montana's story is more than headlines, it's a warning. In the world of rap, being real can make you famous. But it can also make you vulnerable.